Welcome back to Cliffhangers and Page Turners. Are you ready for another deep dive into a great book? This time, we're going back to the Tudors.
Ah, always a fascinating period, right?
Right.
So much going on, so many big personalities.
For sure. But we're doing something a little different this time. We're going to move away from Henry VIII and all that.
Interesting. So who are we going to focus on today?
Well, today's deep dive is all about the women behind the scenes. The ladies-in-waiting who serve the Tudor queens. We'll be exploring their lives, their relationships, and their ambitions. All through this book by Nicola Clark. It's called The Waiting Game, the untold story of the women who served the Tudor queens.
Ooh, that sounds pretty interesting. I'm always curious about those untold stories, the ones that history kind of forgets. What does Clark say about these women? What makes them so special?
She really brings them to life, you know?
Yeah.
They're not just names in a history book anymore. They become real people with real stories, like Maria de Salinas, for example. She came to England with Catherine of Aragon all the way from Spain.
Wow, I can't even imagine. Leaving your home as a young woman to travel to a totally different country with a princess? That must have been a huge change for her.
It was. And then, of course, that princess becomes queen. And suddenly, Maria is right there in the middle of all the Tudor drama and politics. I mean, can you imagine the pressure? Clark actually describes Catherine's wedding night to Prince Arthur in detail. You're practically right there in the room with the ladies-in-waiting, feeling all the stress and excitement of getting everything perfect.
I bet there was a lot of whispering going on and rushing around. So what about Maria? What happened to her after Arthur died? Did she stay loyal to Catherine?
Oh, she was totally devoted to Catherine. Even when Catherine was fighting to be recognized as queen, Maria was right there by her side.
That's some serious loyalty. It makes you think about the strong bond they must have had. But I'm curious, was it always easy for them? Did their friendship ever go through tough times?
It wasn't always perfect, no. Clark shows us that they had to deal with some really hard things together. Money problems, political isolation, even the threat of being sent back to Spain. And one of the things I really liked about this book is how Clark doesn't shy away from showing Maria's flaws. You know,
Oh, what do you mean?
she wasn't this perfect saint. She had ambitions, she made mistakes, even got mixed up in some things that weren't exactly, well, ethical. It makes her a much more interesting character, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what makes historical figures so fascinating, right? They're complex and flawed, just like us. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and events, it's about people.
Exactly. And through Maria, we get this inside look into the lives of the Tudor queens, their anxieties, their fears, the challenges they faced. Clark talks about everything from their worries about childbirth to the really intense world of court politics. For example, did you know that some women use birthing girdles with prayers inscribed on them?
Really? Wow, that's incredible. I guess when childbirth was so dangerous, you'd try anything for a little extra help. It really shows you just how scared people were back then.
It does, doesn't it? And speaking of court politics, that's where things get really juicy. Clark introduces us to another lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth Stafford, the Duchess of Norfolk.
Oh, the Duchess of Norfolk. I remember reading about her. Wasn't her family completely divided when Anne Boleyn came on the scene?
You got it. Her husband was a big supporter of Anne Boleyn, but Elizabeth stayed loyal to Catherine of Aragon. Can you imagine the tension in that household?
Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. Being stuck between your family and your loyalty to the Queen, that must have been so difficult for her.
Well, get this. Elizabeth was actually caught spying for Catherine against her own husband. Talk about dedication.
Wow. That's taking loyalty to a whole new level. It shows you that these women weren't just passively standing by. They were willing to take real risks to defend what they believed in. They were playing the game too.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how much of what happened in Tudor times was actually because of these women working behind the scenes? We always hear about the kings and queens, but what about the people in their inner circle, right?
That's one of the big points that Clark makes in her book. These women weren't just watching from the sidelines. They were right there in the middle of it all. They ran estates, they had influence, and they even found ways to use the system to their advantage. And Elizabeth's story is just one example.
Right. It wasn't always a simple choice between your queen or your family, was it? I'd love to hear about some of the other women who faced those kinds of tough decisions.
Well, let's talk about Anne Bassett. She actually served multiple Tudor queens. Whoa, multiple. That's crazy. Imagine having to deal with all those changes in power. From Anne Boleyn's super extravagant coronation to the sadness and uncertainty after Jane Seymour died. She must have seen it all.
Exactly. It makes you wonder about her relationships with all these different queens. Like, did her loyalty change every time there was a new monarch? Or did she have her own personal allegiances that she stuck to no matter what?
That's a really interesting question. It's like getting a peek into the human side of history, you know? How personal relationships and these huge political events were all tangled up together.
And speaking of interesting people, we can't forget Mary Howard, the Duchess of Richmond. She was Elizabeth Stafford's daughter, so maybe she inherited that talent for intrigue.
Oh, yeah. I think I remember reading about her. Wasn't she involved in some kind of scandal, something that could have had huge consequences for the whole Tudor dynasty?
That's the one. Mary got caught up in a forbidden romance, a love story that could have blown everything up. I have to say, Clark's writing is really amazing here. She doesn't just tell you the historical facts. She weaves in these personal stories that make history come alive.
It's like you're right there in the Tudor court, listening to all the gossip and rumors. But it's not just about the juicy details, right? There's more to it than that.
Definitely. Through Mary's story, we learn about all sorts of things, like how people felt about childbirth, the importance of education for women back then, and the immense pressure they faced in court. Clark even goes into detail about the fashion of the time, describing the clothes, the jewelry, the hairstyles.
I love those details. It's like looking through a Tudor fashion magazine.
It is, isn't it? And, those details aren't just there for fun. They tell us a lot about how society worked back then, the different levels of power and the cultural influences. And they show us how these women tried to express themselves, even within all the rules and restrictions of court life.
Yeah, it shows that they had agency, you know? They were trying to have some control over their own lives in a world that was constantly trying to tell them who they should be.
Absolutely. Clark is basically saying, hey, these weren't just nameless faces in a history book. They were real women with passions, ambitions, and heartbreaks.
Yeah.
And sometimes those passions got them into trouble. Remember Jane Parker, Viscountess Rochford? She got caught up in the downfalls of both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard.
Oh, wow. Talk about bad timing. Twice. Makes you wonder what her motivations were, right? But was she ambitious, jealous, or just unlucky?
That's what I love about Clark's approach. She doesn't try to give you easy answers. She lays out all the facts, the rumors, the different perspectives, and lets you, the reader, decide what you think.
It encourages you to think critically about history, right? To understand that it's not always black and white, that there are nuances and complexities to every story.
I was honestly surprised by how much conflicting information there was. It just goes to show you that history is always open to interpretation.
And that's why it's so important to look at things from different angles, to consider different sources and viewpoints. And Clark does a great job of weaving together letters, court records, and personal accounts to paint a fuller picture.
It makes you think about the challenges of writing history, right? How do you sort through all that conflicting information and present a balanced view of what happened, especially when it comes to politically charged situations?
That's where Clark's expertise as a historian really shines through. She manages to stay impartial. She presents all sides of the story, the arguments for and against certain actions, but she never tells you what to believe.
I find that really refreshing, especially these days when it feels like everyone has such strong opinions about everything. It encourages us to engage with history on a deeper level, to think for ourselves.
Exactly. History isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the human stories behind those events, the choices people made, the things that shaped their lives.
And that brings us to a really important question. What can we learn from all this? What's the lasting impact of the waiting game for us, living in the 21st century?
I think for me, it's a reminder that women have always been there, shaping history. Even if their stories don't always make it into the textbooks, these were strong women facing huge challenges, making tough decisions, and yeah, they left their mark on the world.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like how their lives connect to the challenges that women still face today. I wonder, do you think these women would have been like social media influencers? Or maybe they would have started their own businesses.
Oh, that's a fun thought.
Yeah.
I mean, their world was so different, but their resourcefulness, their ability to work within the system, it's pretty inspiring.
Imagine Marita de Salinas using her connections to get funding for her startup. Or Elizabeth Stafford leading a political campaign.
And then there's Anne Bassett, quietly observing all those powerful figures, watching them rise and fall. Think of the insight she must have had about people, about leadership. That kind of wisdom is valuable no matter what time period you're in.
It shows you that no matter what, women have always found ways to make their voices heard, to make a difference. This book really drives that point home.
It does, yeah. And that's one of the things that makes the waiting game so compelling. It's a reminder that history is full of these amazing, complex people who might not always be in the spotlight, but they're still playing a crucial role in how things unfold.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the waiting game, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this book?
I hope it encourages them to dig a little deeper, to look beyond the big names and the famous stories and consider the perspectives of those who might have been working behind the scenes. History becomes so much richer when we include those often forgotten voices.
I completely agree. Well, there you have it, our exploration of the waiting game, the untold story of the women who served the Tudor queens by Nicola Clark. A fascinating look into the lives of these incredible women, filled with drama, intrigue, and insights that are still relevant today.
And remember, this is just the beginning. There are so many more stories out there waiting to be discovered, so many perspectives to explore.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deeper into the world around you. We'll be back next week when we'll be reviewing To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee.
Oh, I can't wait for that one.
But until then, happy reading.